At 11:47 p.m. on March 8, 2023, 26-year-old Keisha Williams made what would be her final call for help. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled with terror as she described the man standing outside her Atlanta apartment. Just minutes earlier, Keisha had been celebrating a job interview that could change her life. She had dreams of opening her own event planning company, dreams that her grandmother Mama Ruby said were as bright as the smile Keisha wore to church every Sunday. What you're about to hear is a story of love turned deadly, a system that looked the other way, and a family's fight for justice that changed everything. This is the story of a Spelman College graduate who believed in second chances, a man whose charm masked a violent past, and the 9 months that transformed a fairy tale romance into a nightmare that would rock the city of Atlanta. Tonight, we uncover the warning signs that everyone missed, the protection order that became worthless paper, and the shocking truth about what really happened in those final moments. Because sometimes, the people we trust to protect us are the very ones who fail us when we need them most. This is the life and death of Keisha Williams. Keisha Marie Williams was born on a hot July morning in 1996 in Atlanta, Georgia. Her mother, struggling with addiction, made the hardest decision of her life when Keisha was just 3 years old. She drove her daughter to a small brick house on the west side of Atlanta and knocked on the door of Ruby Williams, Keisha's grandmother. Mama Ruby, as everyone called her, opened that door and never looked back. From that moment on, Keisha became her world. Growing up in Mama Ruby's house meant Sunday morning church services at Mount Calvary Baptist, where Keisha's voice could be heard above everyone else's in the youth choir. It meant homework at the kitchen table, while the smell of cornbread filled the air. It meant learning that education was the key to everything. Mama Ruby worked double shifts at the hospital just to make sure Keisha had everything she needed. When other kids were playing video games, Keisha was organizing bake sales for the church building fund. When her friends were at the mall, she was planning community cleanup days in their neighborhood. By the time Keisha graduated from high school, she had her sights set on Spelman College. Mama Ruby cried the day that acceptance letter came in the mail. For years later, Keisha walked across that stage with a degree in business administration and a plan to change the world, one event at a time. She landed a job at a marketing firm in Buckhead, but her real dream was written in bold letters on the vision board hanging in her apartment. Williams Events, her own company, her own legacy. Keisha's cousin Jasmine lived just 20 minutes away and saw her almost every weekend. She remembers Keisha as the family member who remembered everyone's birthday, who organized the annual family reunion, who could turn any gathering into something special. Her best friend Nia, from college, said Keisha had this gift of making people feel important, like they mattered. Whether it was a church anniversary or a neighbor's graduation party, Keisha threw herself into making other people's dreams come true. But there was something about Keisha that would eventually put her in danger. She had this way of seeing the good in everyone, even when that good was buried under layers of hurt and anger. Mama Ruby used to warn her, "Baby girl, not everyone deserves your kindness." Keisha would just smile and say, "Grandma, somebody showed kindness to me when I needed it most." She was talking about Mama Ruby, of course, but this beautiful quality, this refusal to give up on people, would soon attract someone who didn't deserve her light, someone who would take that kindness and twist it into something unrecognizable. What Keisha didn't know was that her name was already being spoken in conversations she wasn't part of. Someone had been watching her social media, studying her routines, learning her patterns. Someone who had perfected the art of making women fall in love with a version of himself that didn't really exist. Before we continue with Keisha's story, if you're finding this case as compelling as we are, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps us bring you more stories that matter. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to stay updated on cases like this one. We promise every story we tell honors the victims and their families, while shedding light on the systems that failed them. Now back to Keisha's story, because what happened next would change everything. It was September 14th, 2019, at the Howard University Alumni Mixer in downtown Atlanta, when Marcus Johnson first laid eyes on Keisha Williams. The event was held at an upscale rooftop bar, and Keisha had come with her friend Nia to network and maybe make some business connections for a future event planning company. She wore a navy blue dress that Mama Ruby had helped her pick out, and her hair was styled in loose curls that caught the light every time she laughed. Marcus was 32, 6 years older than Keisha, with a smile that could light up a room and a confidence that drew people to him like a magnet. He approached her at the bar, introduced himself as a Howard graduate from the class of 2009, and within minutes had her laughing at stories about his college days. When she asked what he did for work, he gave her a charming smile and said he was in sales. High-end sales, he called it. Technology solutions for corporate clients. The details were always vague, but the way he said it made it sound important. What caught Keisha's attention wasn't just his looks or his charm. It was the way he seemed genuinely interested in her dreams. When she told him about wanting to start her own event planning business, he didn't laugh or suggest she think smaller. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started showing her venues around the city, talking about connections he had, people he could introduce her to. For a young woman who had been working toward this dream for years, meeting someone who believed in it felt like a sign. Marcus drove a black BMW that looked fresh off the lot. His clothes were designer, his watch expensive, his apartment in Midtown furnished like something out of a magazine. For a man who claimed to work in sales, he seemed to have more money than most people made in a year. When Keisha asked about it, he'd joke about being good at what he did, about having invested wisely. He paid for everything on their dates, expensive dinners at restaurants Keisha had only read about online, weekend trips to Savannah and Charleston, shopping sprees, where he'd insist on buying her things she'd never asked for. Their relationship moved fast. Within 3 weeks, Marcus was posting pictures of them together on Instagram. Within 2 months, he was telling her he loved her. The comments on their photos were filled with heart emojis and people saying they looked perfect together. Keisha's social media became a highlight reel of romantic dinners, surprise flowers delivered to her job, and weekend getaways that looked like scenes from a movie. But there were moments that made Keisha pause, even in those early days. Marcus had a habit of picking up her phone when she wasn't looking, scrolling through her messages, with a playful smile on his face. When she'd reach for it back, he'd laugh and say he was just making sure no other men were trying to steal his girl. It felt flattering at first, like he cared so much about her that he couldn't stand the thought of losing her. Then came the comments about her friends. When Nia would call to make plans, Marcus would roll his eyes and suggest they stay in instead. When Jasmine invited her to family gatherings, he'd find reasons why they couldn't go. "You don't need those friends, baby, you got me," he'd say, pulling her close and kissing her forehead. "We're building something special here. Just us." The first time he showed up at her job unannounced, Keisha was in a meeting with a potential client. Her co-worker knocked on the conference room door and told her there was someone in the lobby asking for her. When she saw Marcus standing there with flowers and that charming smile, her heart raced. Part of her was flattered by the romantic gesture, but another part of her, a small voice in the back of her mind, wondered how he knew she'd be free to see him. Mama Ruby met Marcus for the first time at Sunday dinner in October 2019. She watched him charm the family, compliment her cooking, and tell stories that had everyone laughing. But when Keisha went to the kitchen to help with dessert, Mama Ruby followed her. "That boy's got secrets," she said quietly, her hands busy cutting sweet potato pie. "I can feel it in my bones." When Keisha tried to defend him, Mama Ruby just shook her head. "Baby girl, I've seen smooth talkers before. They're the most dangerous kind." Cousin Jasmine was more direct. After Marcus left that Sunday, she pulled Keisha aside and asked the questions that had been bothering her. How exactly did he make his money? Why didn't he ever talk about his family? Why did he seem to know so much about Keisha's schedule and whereabouts? "Girl, something ain't right about him," Jasmine said. "He's too perfect, too smooth. Real men have rough edges." But Keisha was falling in love, and love has a way of making red flags look like romantic gestures. When her family expressed concerns, she'd get defensive. "Y'all just don't know him like I do," she'd say. "He's been hurt before. That's why he's protective. He's not controlling, he's caring." She'd point to the flowers, the expensive dinners, the way he looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. What Keisha didn't know was that there was another woman who had once said those exact same words. A woman named Tiffany Rodriguez, who had dated Marcus 2 years earlier. A woman who had also thought his attention was romantic. His jealousy was love. His need to know where she was at all times was just him being a good boyfriend. A woman who had eventually filed a restraining order against Marcus Johnson after he put her in the hospital with a broken rib and a black eye that took 3 weeks to heal. Marcus had made sure Keisha would never find out about Tiffany. He'd carefully crafted his story, his social media presence, his entire persona to hide the man he really was. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when someone starts digging. And someone was about to start digging into Marcus Johnson's past, someone who loved Keisha enough to risk everything to protect her. When the pandemic hit in March 2020, the world changed overnight. Businesses shut down, people were told to stay home, and suddenly everyone's life got turned upside down. For Marcus, this was the perfect opportunity he had been waiting for. Within 2 weeks of the lockdown orders, he was standing at Keisha's apartment door with 2 suitcases and that charming smile she had fallen in love with. "Baby, my lease is up, and with everything crazy right now, it just makes sense for us to ride this out together," he said, setting his bags down in her living room like the decision had already been made. Keisha hesitated for just a moment. They had been dating for 6 months, and while she loved him, moving in together felt like a big step. But Marcus was already unpacking, already talking about how romantic it would be to spend all this time together, just the 2 of them against the world. What started as a temporary arrangement quickly became permanent. Marcus's clothes filled half her closet. His name went on the lease when it came time to renew. His opinions became the loudest voice in every decision about their shared space. The vision board that had hung on Keisha's wall, the one with pictures of her dream event planning company, mysteriously disappeared one day. When she asked about it, Marcus shrugged and said it was probably knocked down when he was rearranging furniture. He never helped her look for it. The isolation started slowly, so gradually that Keisha barely noticed it happening. When Mama Ruby would call for their weekly Sunday video chats, Marcus would roll his eyes and make comments about how she was always on that phone. "You on that phone too much, baby," he'd say, not quite asking her to hang up, but making it clear he wasn't happy about the call. "We supposed to be spending quality time together." When Nia would try to set up virtual hangouts with their college friends, Marcus would suggest they do something else instead. "Movie night," he'd say, or cooking dinner together. Always something that required Keisha's full attention. Always something that made it impossible for her to connect with the people who had known her longest. Slowly, those calls became less frequent. The group chat that had been active for years went quiet on Keisha's end. Marcus had opinions about everything. The way she dressed, the food she cooked, the way she styled her hair. But he was clever about how he delivered his criticism, wrapping it in concern and love. "Baby, that dress kinda tight, don't you think?" he'd say, tilting his head like he was genuinely worried about her. "I just don't want other men looking at you the wrong way." When she'd change into something looser, he'd smile and tell her how much better she looked, how classy she was, how lucky he was to have a woman who cared about how she presented herself. By summer 2020, Marcus had convinced Keisha to let him handle all the bills. "Let me take care of you, baby," he'd said when she mentioned stress about rent and utilities. "I make more money than you anyway. You just focus on your job and let me handle the big stuff." It seemed sweet, generous even. What Keisha didn't realize was that by giving him control over the finances, she was also giving him control over her ability to leave. The marketing firm where Keisha worked had shifted to remote work, which meant she was home all day, every day, with Marcus. He worked from home too, though his job seemed to involve a lot of phone calls behind closed doors and meetings that he never talked about afterward. When Keisha would ask about his day, he'd give vague answers about clients and deals, then quickly change the subject to her work, her colleagues, the people she interacted with during her virtual meetings. It was during one of those conversations about her co-workers that the mask slipped for the first time. Keisha had mentioned that her colleague David had complimented a presentation she'd given during a team meeting. She was excited about the positive feedback, proud of the work she'd done. But when she told Marcus about it, his expression changed. The smile disappeared. His jaw tightened. "David?" he asked, his voice taking on a tone Keisha had never heard before. The same David who's always commenting on your posts. Keisha tried to explain that David was just being professional, that it was normal for co-workers to support each other. But Marcus wasn't hearing it. He stood up from the couch where they'd been sitting, started pacing around the living room like a caged animal. "I don't like how that man looks at you," Marcus said, his voice getting louder. "I see how he acts in those video meetings. Always finding reasons to talk to you. Always trying to get your attention." When Keisha tried to defend David, tried to explain that they were just colleagues, Marcus grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to make his point. Firm enough to scare her. "Don't defend another man to me," he said, his face close to hers. "I'm your man. I'm the only man you should be worried about impressing." The grip on her arm lasted maybe 5 seconds, but the fear stayed with Keisha for hours afterward. When Marcus realized what he'd done, he immediately switched back to the charming man she'd fallen in love with. He apologized, said he was just stressed about work, that the pandemic had everyone on edge. He bought her flowers the next day, cooked her favorite dinner, told her how much he loved her and how sorry he was for losing his temper. He was just stressed about work. Keisha told herself that night, rubbing the spot on her arm where his fingers had pressed too hard. The pandemic is getting to everyone. It's not like him to act that way. But it was like him, and it was about to get worse. Christmas 2020 was the first holiday Keisha missed with her family. Mama Ruby had planned a small gathering, just immediate family, following all the safety protocols. She'd been cooking for days, excited to see her granddaughter and meet the man who had become such a big part of her life. But when Keisha called to confirm their arrival time, Marcus was standing right behind her, shaking his head. "Baby, with everything going on, I just don't think it's safe," he said loud enough for Mama Ruby to hear through the phone. "Your grandmother's older, high risk. We shouldn't take any chances." When Keisha hesitated, he added, "Besides, I was hoping we could start our own traditions. Just us." Keisha found herself making excuses to her grandmother, explaining about safety concerns and starting new traditions. She could hear the disappointment in Mama Ruby's voice, could picture her sitting at that kitchen table with food for 10 people and only half the family there. But Marcus was already planning their own celebration, talking about how special it would be. Just the two of them. When Mama Ruby's birthday came around in February 2021, the same thing happened. Marcus had concerns about safety, about Keisha's health, about the risks of being around other people. Each time, his reasons sounded logical, carrying even, but the result was always the same. Keisha, isolated from the people who loved her most, spending every important moment with the one person who was slowly taking control of her entire life. What Keisha didn't know was that Marcus had been planning this isolation for months. Every suggestion, every concern, every loving gesture was part of a larger strategy to cut her off from her support system. He knew that as long as Mama Ruby and Jasmine were in her life, they would continue to ask questions, continue to voice their concerns about him. But if he could convince Keisha to distance herself from them willingly, if he could make it seem like her choice, then no one could blame him when things went wrong. And things were about to go very, very wrong. What Marcus didn't realize was that his carefully constructed plan was about to face its biggest challenge yet. Someone who loved Keisha wasn't going to give up that easily. If you've been following Keisha's story so far, go ahead and hit that like button to let us know you're invested in what happens next. And make sure you're subscribed because trust me, you don't want to miss how this unfolds. Sit tight because the story is about to get much more intense, and what happens next will shock you. The person who refused to give up on Keisha was her cousin Jasmine. While Marcus had successfully convinced Keisha to miss family gatherings and cut back on phone calls, Jasmine wasn't the type to just sit back and watch her cousin disappear. She had always been protective of Keisha, and something about Marcus Johnson didn't sit right with her. So in March 2021, she decided to do something about it. Jasmine worked at a law firm downtown, which meant she had access to background check services that most people didn't. She told herself she was just being cautious, just looking out for family. But what she found when she ran Marcus Johnson's name through the system made her blood run cold. Marcus Anthony Johnson had been arrested in 2017 on drug dealing charges in Fulton County. The case file showed he'd been caught with enough cocaine to suggest he wasn't just a user, but someone moving serious weight. He'd pleaded down to possession with intent to distribute and served 18 months in state prison. But that wasn't the worst part. In 2018, just 6 months after his release, Marcus had been arrested again, this time for domestic violence against his then-girlfriend, Tiffany Rodriguez. The police report was brutal to read. Tiffany had called 911 from a hospital parking lot, saying her boyfriend had beaten her so badly she thought he might have broken her ribs. The photos attached to the file showed a young woman whose face was so swollen her own mother wouldn't have recognized her. Tiffany had tried to press charges, but Marcus's lawyer had gotten the case dismissed on a technicality. Something about the arresting officer not reading him his rights properly. But Tiffany hadn't given up. She'd filed for a restraining order, and in her statement to the court, she'd written something that made Jasmine's hands shake as she read it. He told me that if I ever tried to leave him, he would kill me. And I believe him. The restraining order had been granted, but it had expired in 2020, just a few months before Marcus met Keisha. There was more. Marcus had violated his probation twice, once for failing drug tests and once for being arrested in a bar fight that left another man with a concussion. Each time, he'd managed to avoid serious consequences, talking his way out of trouble with that same charm that had fooled Keisha. Jasmine tried calling Keisha immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. She tried texting, but got no response. When she drove to Keisha's apartment that evening, Marcus answered the door with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Jasmine, what a surprise," he said, not moving to let her inside. "Keisha's not feeling well. Maybe you could come back another time." But Jasmine could hear Keisha's voice in the background, asking who was at the door. When Keisha appeared behind Marcus, Jasmine was shocked by what she saw. Her cousin had lost weight, dark circles under her eyes, and something in her expression that looked like fear. Jasmine tried to get Keisha alone, but Marcus never left their side. He had an answer for everything, an explanation for why Keisha looked so tired, why she hadn't been returning calls, why she couldn't come to the door to talk. When Jasmine finally left that night, she knew she had to find another way to reach her cousin. Meanwhile, Marcus's control over Keisha was becoming absolute. He had taken her car keys, claiming her car was making a weird noise, and he'd dropped it off at his mechanic friend's shop. Days turned into weeks, and the car never came back. When Keisha asked about it, Marcus would get irritated and say his friend was backed up. That good work takes time. Without her car, Keisha was completely dependent on Marcus for transportation. She couldn't go anywhere without him knowing about it. Couldn't make any stops he didn't approve of. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of their apartment and the virtual meetings for her job. But even her work wasn't safe from his control. Marcus had installed monitoring software on her laptop, claiming it was for security purposes. He could see every email she sent, every website she visited, every video call she joined. When her coworker David would make innocent comments during team meetings, Marcus would confront Keisha about it later. "I saw that man flirting with you again today," he'd say, his voice calm but his eyes cold. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't see what's happening?" The threats started in April 2021. Marcus began making comments about what would happen to any man who tried to get too close to his woman. "I would hate to have to handle someone," he'd say, cracking his knuckles. "But a man's got to protect what's his." When Keisha would tell him he was being paranoid, he'd remind her of how much he loved her, how he couldn't stand the thought of losing her to someone else. By May 2021, Keisha knew she was in trouble. The man she'd fallen in love with had been replaced by someone she barely recognized. Someone who watched her every move, controlled her every decision, and made her feel like a prisoner in her own life. She started hiding small amounts of cash when Marcus would give her money for groceries, slipping $20 bills into a hiding spot behind her dresser. It took her 3 weeks to save up enough money for a bus ticket to Mama Ruby's house. On a Tuesday morning in late May, while Marcus was in the shower, Keisha quickly packed a small bag with just the essentials. She left a note saying she needed some space to think, that she'd call him later. Then she walked to the bus stop 6 blocks away and bought a ticket to her grandmother's neighborhood. Mama Ruby took one look at her granddaughter standing on her front porch and knew that everything she'd feared had come true. Keisha was thinner, nervous, jumping at every sound, but she was also determined. "I need to leave him, Grandma," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how I got so lost, but I need to find my way back." They spent that afternoon making plans. Mama Ruby would help her find a new apartment, maybe in a different part of town. Jasmine would help her get a restraining order. They'd figure out how to get her car back, how to separate her finances from Marcus's, how to rebuild the life she'd lost. But Marcus was smarter than they gave him credit for. He had tracking apps on Keisha's phone that she didn't even know about. He knew exactly where she was and how long she'd been there. And he was already on his way. Keisha was in Mama Ruby's kitchen, helping make dinner and feeling hopeful for the first time in months, when she heard his voice at the front door. Loud, angry, demanding to see his girlfriend. Mama Ruby tried to stand between him and the house, but Marcus pushed past her like she wasn't even there. "Baby, what are you doing?" he said when he saw Keisha, his voice switching from angry to hurt in seconds. "I was so worried when I saw your note. Come on, let's go home and talk about this." When Keisha said she wasn't coming with him, when she told him she wanted some time apart, Marcus's mask finally slipped completely. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her toward the door while Mama Ruby screamed and tried to stop him. Neighbors came outside when they heard the commotion, but Marcus was already pushing Keisha into his car. The beating happened in their apartment, behind closed doors, where no one could hear her screams. Marcus used his fists, his feet, and a belt to teach Keisha what happened to women who tried to leave him. When he was finished, Keisha couldn't walk. She couldn't see out of her left eye. She was pretty sure he'd broken at least 2 of her ribs. 3 hours later, Marcus was helping her into his car, telling the neighbors who'd gathered outside that his girlfriend had taken a bad fall down the stairs. "You know how clumsy she can be," he said with that charming smile, while Keisha sat in the passenger seat, unable to speak through her swollen lips. At the emergency room, Dr. Patel looked at Keisha's injuries and knew immediately that she hadn't fallen down any stairs. The pattern of bruises, the defensive wounds on her arms, the way she flinched when anyone moved too quickly. It all told a story that Marcus's explanation couldn't cover. "Miss Williams," Dr. Patel said quietly when Marcus stepped out to make a phone call, "these injuries are consistent with assault. If someone is hurting you, I can help. There are resources, people who can keep you safe." But Keisha just stared at the wall and repeated the story Marcus had told her to tell. She'd fallen down the stairs at her grandmother's house. It was an accident. She was clumsy. When Dr. Patel pressed her for more details, Keisha shut down completely, refusing to say another word until Marcus came back. After that night, Keisha's phone disappeared. Marcus said it had been damaged in her fall, and he'd get her a new one soon. But days turned into weeks, and no new phone appeared. Her laptop was moved to Marcus's desk, and she was only allowed to use it for work while he watched. All her social media accounts were deactivated. Her email password was changed. Mama Ruby tried calling the apartment phone, but Marcus would answer and say Keisha was resting, that she was still recovering from her accident, that she'd call back when she felt better. But that call never came. For the first time since she was 3 years old, Keisha Williams was completely cut off from her family, trapped in an apartment with a man who had shown her exactly what would happen if she ever tried to leave again. But what Marcus didn't know was that someone else had been watching, someone who had seen him drag Keisha out of Mama Ruby's house that day, and that someone was about to make a phone call that would change everything. The someone who had been watching was Mrs. Dolores Johnson, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment next to Mama Ruby. Mrs. Johnson had seen Marcus drag Keisha to his car that day, had heard the screaming, had watched a young woman being taken against her will, and Mrs. Johnson had done something that would prove crucial later. She had written down Marcus's license plate number. But Mrs. Johnson didn't just write down the number and forget about it. She called the police that very evening and filed a report about what she'd witnessed. The responding officer took her statement, but without Keisha present to confirm she'd been taken against her will, there wasn't much they could do. Still, the report was filed, creating an official record of what had happened on May 23, 2021. Back in their apartment, Keisha was living in what could only be described as captivity. Marcus watched her every move, controlled every aspect of her life, and made it clear that any attempt to contact the outside world would result in consequences she didn't want to face. But Keisha was smarter than Marcus gave her credit for, and she was planning her escape. It started with an old phone she found in a box of her things that Marcus hadn't bothered to go through. It was an iPhone she'd used in college, outdated and nearly dead, but it still worked. She hid it behind her dresser, the same place she'd once hidden money, and every few days when Marcus was in the shower or out running errands, she'd charge it for a few minutes using a charger cord she'd hidden in her makeup bag. The phone became her lifeline. She couldn't make calls because Marcus would hear her, but she could take photos. Pictures of the bruises on her ribs that turned from purple to yellow to green over the course of weeks. Pictures of the finger marks on her throat from the night he'd strangled her until she almost passed out. Pictures of her swollen lip, her black eye, the bruises on her arms that looked like handprints. Each photo was automatically uploaded to her cloud storage, a digital record of what Marcus was doing to her. She created a folder and titled it Evidence, then changed the name to something Marcus would never think to look for if he found the phone. She called it Recipes. But Keisha was getting more than just photos. She was recording conversations. When Marcus would threaten her, when he described what he'd do to her family if she ever tried to leave again, when he'd talk about the people he knew who could make problems disappear, Keisha would secretly record every word. Marcus had been using drugs more heavily since bringing Keisha back from Mama Ruby's house. What had started as occasional cocaine use had become a daily habit. The drugs made him paranoid, unpredictable, and more violent than ever. He'd stay up for days at a time, pacing around the apartment, checking the windows, convinced that someone was watching them. During one of these drug-fueled episodes in June 2021, Marcus showed Keisha something that made her blood run cold. He pulled a gun out of a shoebox in their bedroom closet, a black pistol that looked like it had seen plenty of use. "This is my protection," he said, holding the weapon like it was something precious. "Nobody's gonna hurt what's mine, and nobody's gonna take you away from me again." Keisha knew enough about guns to know that Marcus, with his felony record, wasn't legally allowed to own one. She also knew that a man who had already beaten her half to death and was now showing her his gun wasn't planning to let her live if she tried to leave again. That same week, during one of Marcus's trips to meet his drug dealer, Keisha used her hidden phone to call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The counselor who answered was named Patricia, and she became the first person Keisha had spoken to outside of Marcus in over a month. "I need help," Keisha whispered into the phone, watching the door to make sure Marcus wasn't coming back early. "My boyfriend is going to kill me if I try to leave." Patricia walked Keisha through safety planning, gave her information about shelters and legal resources, and most importantly, told her she wasn't alone. They set up a system where Keisha could text a specific number if she was in immediate danger, and someone would call 911 for her. But Marcus was getting suspicious. He'd started noticing things, small things that didn't add up. Keisha seemed less broken than she had been right after the beating. Sometimes he'd catch her looking at him with something that looked like calculation rather than fear. He began searching the apartment more frequently, going through her things with the methodical precision of someone who knew what it felt like to be hunted. It was during one of these searches in July 2021 that Marcus found something that sent him into a rage unlike anything Keisha had ever seen. Hidden in her makeup bag, he discovered the call log from her conversations with the domestic violence hotline. The beating that followed was the worst yet. Marcus didn't just use his fists this time. He used a lamp, a belt, and anything else he could get his hands on. When Keisha tried to run to the bathroom and lock the door, he kicked it down. When she tried to crawl under the bed, he dragged her out by her ankles. "You want to snitch on me?" he screamed, hitting her with each word. "You want to call people and tell them our business? I'll show you what happens to snitches." But this time, Marcus made a mistake. This time, he was so loud, so violent, that the neighbors couldn't ignore what was happening. Mrs. Tasha Adams, who lived in the apartment directly below them, called 911 and told the dispatcher that someone upstairs was being murdered. When the police arrived, They found Marcus in the hallway outside their apartment, calm as could be, telling them there had been a misunderstanding. "My girlfriend fell again," he said with that same charming smile. "She's really clumsy, always hurting herself. The neighbor must have heard her crying when she got hurt." But this time was different. This time, Officer Sarah Martinez looked at Marcus Johnson and remembered something. She remembered Mrs. Dolores Johnson's report from May, the one about a young woman being dragged away against her will. She remembered the license plate number that matched the car parked outside. And when she looked at Marcus's face, she remembered another report, one from 2018, involving a woman named Tiffany Rodriguez. "Sir, we're going to need to speak with your girlfriend," Officer Martinez said. "Alone." What happened next would determine whether Keisha Williams lived or died, because Marcus Johnson was about to find out that his carefully constructed world of control and violence was about to come crashing down around him, and he wasn't going to go quietly. Officer Martinez was joined by her partner, Officer David Jackson, a veteran cop who had seen enough domestic violence cases to know when someone was lying. While Officer Martinez kept Marcus talking in the hallway, Officer Jackson knocked on the apartment door and identified himself as police. When Keisha opened the door, both officers immediately knew that Marcus's story about his clumsy girlfriend was complete nonsense. Keisha's face was so swollen, she could barely open her left eye. Blood was still dripping from her nose. Her shirt was torn, and there were already dark bruises forming on her neck in the shape of fingers. "Ma'am, we need to talk," Officer Jackson said gently. "Are you safe right now?" For a moment, Keisha stood frozen in the doorway. This was the moment she'd been planning for, praying for. But now that it was here, she was terrified. She could hear Marcus's voice in the hallway, could feel his presence even though he wasn't looking at her. She knew that if she didn't speak up now, she might never get another chance. "No," she whispered, so quietly that Officer Jackson had to lean in to hear her. "I'm not safe. He's going to kill me." What happened next moved faster than Keisha had ever imagined possible. Officer Jackson called for backup and an ambulance, while Officer Martinez placed Marcus under arrest. As the handcuffs went on, Marcus's charming mask finally slipped completely. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, struggling against the restraints. "She's lying. She fell down the stairs. Ask anyone. She's always hurting herself." But when the backup officers searched the apartment, they found Keisha's hidden phone with all the photos and recordings. They found the gun in the bedroom closet. They found evidence of the monitoring software on Keisha's laptop. And most importantly, they found Keisha herself, brave enough to finally tell the truth. At the hospital, while doctors treated her injuries, Keisha told Detective Lisa Chen everything. The isolation, the financial control, the escalating violence, the threats against her family. She showed them the photos she'd been secretly taking, played them the recordings of Marcus threatening to kill her if she ever tried to leave. "I want to press charges," Keisha said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "And I want a protection order. I want him to stay away from me and my family." The evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. He was charged with aggravated domestic assault, possession of a firearm by a felon, stalking, and unlawful imprisonment. His bail was set at $50,000, an amount that should have kept him locked up while awaiting trial. The court hearing for the protection order was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Keisha spent those 2 weeks staying with Mama Ruby, sleeping in her childhood bedroom, trying to remember what it felt like to be safe. Jasmine drove her to the courthouse on the day of the hearing, both women nervous, but determined. Marcus's lawyer, a slick-talking man named Robert Kane, immediately went on the attack. He painted Keisha as a scorned woman making up stories to get back at her boyfriend for cheating. He suggested that her injuries were self-inflicted, that she was mentally unstable, that she had a history of lying and manipulation. "Your Honor," Kane said with the confidence of a man who had used these tactics successfully before, "my client is a successful businessman who fell in love with the wrong woman. Miss Williams is clearly suffering from some form of mental illness that causes her to fabricate elaborate stories of abuse. The photos she claims show evidence of domestic violence could have been taken anywhere, at any time." But Keisha was ready for this. She'd prepared for weeks, going over her testimony with victim advocates. practicing staying calm under pressure. When it was her turn to speak, she looked directly at the judge and told her story with a clear, steady voice. "Your Honor, I have recordings of him threatening to kill me. I have photos of injuries that match his patterns of violence. I have medical records from the hospital. I have witness statements from neighbors who heard the abuse happening. This isn't mental illness or revenge. This is a man who nearly killed me, and who will kill me if he gets the chance." The judge, the Honorable Michael Hathaway, listened to 3 hours of testimony, reviewed the evidence, and made his decision. The protection order was granted. Marcus was ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from Keisha, her family, her workplace, and anywhere she might reasonably be expected to go. But while the hearing was taking place, something was happening that would change everything. Someone had posted Marcus's $50,000 bail. The money had come from an account registered to a business called Johnson Holdings LLC, a company that investigators would later discover was connected to Marcus's drug-dealing operation. Marcus walked out of jail that same afternoon, while Keisha was at Mama Ruby's house celebrating what she thought was her freedom. He immediately violated the terms of his bail by using a phone to access social media. We began posting cryptic messages that anyone who knew him would recognize as threats. "Some people don't know when to keep their mouths shut," he posted on Instagram. "But they gonna learn. They gonna learn real soon. Snitches get stitches," he wrote on Facebook. "And some snitches get worse than stitches." He posted photos of guns, photos of news articles about women who had been killed by their ex-boyfriends, photos of Keisha from happier times with captions like, "What's mine stays mine." But Marcus wasn't just making threats online. He was conducting surveillance. Neighbors around Mama Ruby's house started reporting a black BMW driving slowly through the neighborhood at all hours of the day and night. The car would park across the street from the house, sometimes for hours at a time, with someone inside watching and waiting. Keisha and her family reported these incidents to police, but Marcus was always gone by the time officers arrived. When they checked his known addresses, he was never there. It was like he had vanished, but his presence could be felt everywhere. The psychological impact on Keisha was devastating. Just when she thought she was free, just when she thought she was safe, Marcus was proving that he could reach her anywhere. She stopped going outside alone. She changed her daily routines constantly. She jumped at every unexpected sound. "We got you, baby girl," Mama Ruby would tell her granddaughter every night before bed. "You're safe here. We're not going to let anything happen to you." But even Mama Ruby was scared. She'd installed new locks, security cameras, and motion sensor lights around her house. She'd asked neighbors to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. She'd even considered buying a gun, something she'd never thought she'd need in her 72 years of life. 3 weeks after Marcus's release, Keisha made a decision that she hoped would give her some sense of normalcy back. She was going to start looking for her own apartment again, somewhere Marcus had never been, somewhere she could build a new life. She'd found a job interview for a position at a nonprofit organization that helped domestic violence survivors, work that felt meaningful after everything she'd been through. The interview was scheduled for March 8, 2023, at 2 p.m. If it went well, Keisha would finally have the financial independence she needed to truly start over. She was nervous but excited, hopeful for the first time in months that her life was heading in the right direction. What Keisha didn't know was that Marcus had been watching her so closely that he knew about the interview before she'd even told her family about it. He knew what time it was scheduled, what building it was in, and what route she'd take to get there. He also knew that she'd been staying at Mama Ruby's house, but that she still had to go back to their old apartment occasionally to get her belongings. He'd been waiting for her to make that mistake, to go back to the place where he knew every entrance, every exit, every hiding spot. On March 8, 2023, Keisha Williams was about to discover that restraining orders and police reports and court hearings couldn't stop a man who had already decided that if he couldn't have her, nobody could. The final chapter of Keisha's story was about to begin, and it would happen in the place where their relationship had first gone wrong. The apartment where Marcus had isolated her, controlled her, and nearly killed her before. The apartment he was watching right now, waiting for her to come home. What Marcus didn't realize was that Keisha had learned to be just as strategic as he was. But his obsession was about to lead to a confrontation that would end everything. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe, because we're about to get to the most intense part of Keisha's story. March 8th, 2023, started as the best day Keisha had experienced in almost 2 years. She woke up in Mama Ruby's house feeling hopeful, excited about the job interview that could change everything. The position was with Safe Haven Atlanta, a nonprofit that helped domestic violence survivors rebuild their lives. It felt like fate, like everything she'd been through had led her to this moment where she could turn her pain into purpose. The interview went better than Keisha had dared to hope. The director, a woman named Angela Davis, had read about Keisha's case in the news and was impressed by her courage in speaking out against domestic violence. "We need someone who understands what our clients are going through," Angela told her. "Someone who's walked in their shoes." By the end of the 2-hour interview, Keisha was offered the job on the spot. $45,000 a year, health benefits, and the chance to help other women escape the kind of hell she'd lived through. Keisha called Nia immediately after leaving the building, practically crying with joy. "Girl, I got it," she screamed into the phone. "I actually got the job." Nia was working downtown and met Keisha at their favorite lunch spot, a little soul food restaurant where they'd celebrated every major milestone since college. They ordered way too much food and spent 2 hours talking about the future, about the apartment Keisha would get, about the life she was going to build. "You did it, Kush," Nia said, raising her sweet tea in a toast. "You survived that monster, and you're about to help other women do the same thing. I'm so proud of you." That evening, Mama Ruby cooked Keisha's favorite meal, fried chicken with mac and cheese and green beans that had been simmering all day. The whole family came over to celebrate. Jasmine brought her kids, who climbed all over their Aunt Keisha like she was a jungle gym. Uncle Jerome told jokes that had everyone laughing until their stomachs hurt. For a few hours, it felt like the old days, before Marcus, before the fear, before everything went wrong. But there was one thing Keisha still needed to do. She had left some important documents at the old apartment, things she'd need for her new job. Her college transcripts, her professional references, her portfolio of work from the marketing firm. Marcus had been in jail when she'd fled, so she'd never had the chance to get everything she needed. "I'll drive you," Jasmine offered when Keisha mentioned having to go back to the apartment. "No, I need to do this alone," Keisha said. "I need to prove to myself that I'm not afraid of that place anymore. Besides, I'll only be there for 20 minutes, just long enough to grab my stuff." At 10:30 p.m., Keisha pulled up to the apartment complex in Mama Ruby's old Honda Civic. The building looked exactly the same, but everything felt different now. She wasn't the broken, isolated woman who had lived here in fear. She was strong now, free, with a new job and a new life waiting for her. What Keisha didn't know was that Marcus had been watching the apartment every night for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. He'd been living in a motel 20 minutes away, surviving on fast food and drugs, obsessed with the idea that Keisha would eventually have to come back. When he saw the Honda pull into the parking lot, his heart started racing. Finally, his patience had paid off. Marcus waited until Keisha had been inside for 10 minutes before he made his move. He'd been studying the building's layout, looking for the best way to get inside without being seen. The back patio door of their old apartment had a broken lock that the landlord had never fixed, something Marcus had complained about when they lived there, but now saw as a gift. Inside the apartment, Keisha was moving quickly, stuffing documents into a large purse and trying not to look around too much. Being there brought back too many memories, too much pain. She found her transcripts in the filing cabinet, her reference letters in the desk drawer, her portfolio under a stack of old magazines. Just a few more minutes and she'd be done. That's when she heard something that made her blood freeze. A sound from the back of the apartment, like a door closing. She stood perfectly still, listening, telling herself it was probably just the neighbors or the building settling. But then she heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through what used to be their bedroom. Keisha's hand shook as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "I think someone's outside my apartment," she whispered to the dispatcher. "Actually, I think they might be inside. I'm at 1247 Peachtree Apartments, Unit 2B. I have a restraining order against my ex-boyfriend, and I think he might be here." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on the way and stayed on the line with her. "Can you get to a safe place? Can you lock yourself in a room?" But before Keisha could answer, she heard Marcus's voice calling her name from the bedroom. "Keisha, baby, I know you're here. I saw your car. Why don't you come back here so we can talk?" "He's inside," Keisha whispered into the phone. "He's in the apartment with me. Please hurry." The responding officers, Patterson and Rodriguez, arrived 12 minutes later and did a walk-around of the building. They knocked on the front door, but got no answer. They checked the windows, which were all closed with the curtains drawn. They looked for signs of forced entry, but didn't see any obvious damage to the front door. After 15 minutes, they reported back to dispatch that there were no signs of trouble and cleared the call. What the officers didn't know was that Marcus had left through the same back patio door he'd entered through, but only after making sure Keisha knew he'd been there. He'd moved things around in the bedroom, left the closet door open, placed one of her old photos face down on the dresser. He wanted her to know that locks and restraining orders and police reports couldn't keep him away from her. Keisha waited 20 minutes after the police left before she came out of the bathroom, where she'd been hiding. The apartment felt different now, violated in a way that made her skin crawl. She grabbed her purse and ran for the front door, not caring if she'd forgotten anything important. But Marcus hadn't really left. He'd been watching from the parking lot, waiting for the police to clear out, waiting for his chance to finish what he'd started. As Keisha ran toward her car, he stepped out from behind a row of parked vehicles. "Going somewhere, baby?" he asked, that same charming smile on his face that had fooled her 3 years ago. But now she could see the madness behind it, the drugs and obsession that had turned him into something inhuman. Keisha ran back toward the apartment building, fumbling with her keys, trying to get back inside where she could lock the door and call for help again. But Marcus was faster, stronger, and he'd been planning this moment for months. He caught her at the front door, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her back toward the building. "You thought you could run from me," he whispered in her ear. "You thought you could destroy my life and just walk away." Keisha broke free and ran back inside the apartment, slamming the door behind her and turning the deadbolt. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone as she dialed 911 again. At 11:47 p.m., the call that would haunt everyone who heard it was placed to the Atlanta Police Department. 911, what's your emergency?" "He's outside," Keisha whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's got something in his hand. Please hurry." "Who's outside, ma'am?" "My ex-boyfriend, Marcus Johnson. I have a restraining order. He's not supposed to be here." The dispatcher could hear something in the background, a sound like someone trying to force a door open. "Ma'am, are you somewhere safe? Can you get to a room with a lock?" "I'm trying," Keisha said, and then there was the sound of breaking glass. Marcus had kicked in the back patio door, the one with the broken lock that had let him in earlier. "He's inside," Keisha screamed into the phone. "He's inside the apartment. Please, somebody help me." What happened next was captured on the 9/11 recording, a piece of evidence that would be played in courtrooms and congressional hearings about domestic violence response. The sound of Keisha running, of Marcus shouting her name, of furniture being overturned as she tried to get away from him. "You ruined my life." Marcus was screaming. "You put me in jail. You turned everyone against me." "Please," Keisha was crying. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Just let me go. I won't bother you anymore." But Marcus was beyond reasoning. He'd been planning this moment for too long, had lost too much to walk away now. The sound of gunshots came through the phone line at 11:52 p.m. 3 shots, fired in rapid succession, followed by silence. "Ma'am, ma'am, are you there?" the dispatcher kept asking, but there was no response. Just the sound of footsteps walking away and a door closing. Paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, breaking down the front door when no one answered their calls. They found Keisha on the floor of the living room, unconscious and bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. One bullet had hit her in the shoulder, one in the abdomen, and one in the chest, just inches from her heart. The paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her, starting IVs, controlling the bleeding, getting her ready for transport. She was still alive, still breathing, but barely. The ambulance screamed through Atlanta traffic, racing against time to get her to Grady Hospital. Mama Ruby got the call at 12:15 a.m. "Mrs. Williams, this is Detective Chun with the Atlanta Police Department. Your granddaughter has been shot. She's been taken to Grady Hospital in critical condition." The family converged on the hospital like a hurricane. Mama Ruby and Jasmine and Uncle Jerome and Nia, all of them praying, crying, demanding answers that no one could give them. The doctors worked on Keisha for 3 hours, trying to repair the damage that Marcus's bullets had done to her body. But some wounds are too deep to heal. At 2:33 a.m. on March 9th, 2023, just hours after landing her dream job, just hours after celebrating with her family, Keisha Williams died from her injuries. She never regained consciousness. She never got to say goodbye to the people who loved her. She never got to help the other women she'd planned to save. Marcus Johnson had taken more than Keisha's life that night. He'd taken her future, her dreams, her chance to turn her suffering into something meaningful. But what he didn't know was that Keisha's story was far from over. Her death would spark changes that would save other women's lives, would expose the failures in a system that was supposed to protect domestic violence victims. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon against evil isn't law enforcement or restraining orders or even justice. Sometimes it's the truth, told by people who refuse to let a good woman's death be meaningless. Marcus Johnson vanished into the night after killing Keisha, but he didn't vanish without a trace. Security cameras at a gas station 12 miles from the apartment complex captured his BMW pulling up to the pumps at 1:47 a.m. The footage showed Marcus filling up his tank, buying energy drinks and snacks, and making a phone call that lasted exactly 3 minutes. Phone records would later reveal he was calling his cousin Deshaun in Houston, Texas. The manhunt began within hours of Keisha's death. The Atlanta Police Department issued a BOLO alert for Marcus Johnson and his vehicle. His photo was sent to law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. The FBI joined the search when investigators realized Marcus had likely crossed state lines, making this a federal case. But Marcus had been planning his escape route for weeks. He'd withdrawn cash from multiple ATMs in the days leading up to the murder, accumulating nearly $8,000. He'd studied maps, identified back roads that avoided major highways and their surveillance cameras. He'd even stolen license plates from a car in a shopping mall parking lot, switching them out before he left Atlanta. For 6 days, Marcus Johnson was a ghost. Police tracked his phone to a cell tower in Birmingham, Alabama, but by the time they got there, the phone had been turned off permanently. They found his BMW abandoned in a Walmart parking lot in Jackson, Mississippi, but Marcus was nowhere to be found. Security footage showed him getting into a red pickup truck, but the license plate was obscured and the driver couldn't be identified. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Marcus's drug dealer in Atlanta, a man named Tony, was arrested on unrelated charges and decided to cooperate with police in exchange for a lighter sentence. Tony told investigators that Marcus had been talking about having family in Texas, specifically a cousin who ran some kind of auto repair business in Houston. FBI agents in Houston began checking auto repair shops, looking for any connection to the Johnson family. They found Deshaun Johnson's shop, D&J Auto Repair, in a rundown part of the city. Surveillance of the business revealed that someone was living in a small apartment above the garage, someone who matched Marcus's description, but who never came outside during daylight hours. On March 15, 2023, at 4:30 a.m., federal agents surrounded D&J Auto Repair. They'd learned that Marcus had a pattern of leaving the building early in the morning to buy food from a 24-hour convenience store 2 blocks away. When Marcus stepped out of the building that morning, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, he found himself face-to-face with a dozen FBI agents with their weapons drawn. "Marcus Johnson, you're under arrest for the murder of Keisha Williams," Special Agent Patricia Moore announced. "Put your hands where we can see them and get on the ground." For a moment, Marcus looked like he might run. His eyes darted left and right, calculating his chances of escape. But there was nowhere to go. He was surrounded, outnumbered and out of options. Slowly, he raised his hands and dropped to his knees. Marcus was extradited back to Georgia within 48 hours. He was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated stalking, violation of a protective order, possession of a firearm by a felon, and terrorism. The terrorism charge was added because prosecutors argued that Marcus had used threats and violence to control Keisha's behavior, fitting the legal definition of domestic terrorism. The trial began 8 months later, in November 2023. Fulton County District Attorney Michael Hayes personally handled the prosecution, calling it one of the most clear-cut cases of domestic violence murder he'd ever seen. The evidence was overwhelming. The 911 recordings, the surveillance footage, the photos and recordings Keisha had secretly made, witness testimony from neighbors and family members. But Marcus's defense attorney, the same Robert Kane, who had tried to discredit Keisha during the protection order hearing, had a strategy. He was going to paint Marcus as a man driven to temporary insanity by love and betrayal. It was a classic domestic violence defense, one that placed the blame on the victim for driving her killer to violence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Kane said during his opening statement, "what you're going to hear is the story of a man who loved a woman so much that he couldn't handle losing her. Marcus Johnson isn't a cold-blooded killer. He's a man who made a terrible mistake in a moment of passion and pain." Kane argued that Marcus had gone to the apartment to talk to Keisha, not to hurt her. He claimed that the gun had gone off accidentally during a struggle, that Marcus never intended to kill the woman he loved. He brought up Keisha's mental health, suggesting that she had been unstable and manipulative, that she had driven Marcus to desperation with false accusations and vindictive behavior. But the prosecution was ready for these tactics. District Attorney Hayes had prepared for months, studying every detail of the case, every piece of evidence. When it was his turn to address the jury, he played the 911 recording of Keisha's final moments. "You heard her voice," Hayes told the jurors, many of whom were crying by the end of the recording. "You heard her terror. You heard her begging for her life. Does that sound like a woman who was manipulating anyone? Or does it sound like a woman who knew she was about to die?" Mama Ruby testified for 3 hours, telling the jury about the granddaughter she'd raised, the dreams Keisha had for her future, the way Marcus had systematically isolated her from her family. Jasmine testified about finding Marcus's criminal record, about watching her cousin disappear into an abusive relationship. Nia testified about the last lunch she'd shared with Keisha, about how excited her friend had been about starting a new life. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Patricia Chun, the medical examiner who had performed Keisha's autopsy. She explained that the gunshot wounds were consistent with an execution-style killing, not an accidental shooting during a struggle. The bullets had been fired from close range, in a pattern that suggested deliberate targeting of vital organs. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Chin testified, "these wounds were inflicted by someone who intended to kill Miss Williams quickly and efficiently. This was not a crime of passion. This was murder." The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Marcus showed no emotion, but Mama Ruby collapsed in tears of relief and exhaustion. During the sentencing phase, the judge listened to impact statements from Keisha's family. Mama Ruby spoke last, her voice strong despite her tears. "That man took my baby girl from me," she said, looking directly at Marcus. "He took her dreams, her future, her chance to help other women. But he didn't break us. We're going to make sure Keisha's death means something. We're going to make sure this never happens to another family." Marcus Johnson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, he finally showed emotion, screaming at Keisha's family that they had ruined his life, that everything was their fault. But Mama Ruby wasn't finished fighting. Even before the trial ended, she had begun working with lawmakers and advocates to change the system that had failed her granddaughter. She partnered with Safe Haven Atlanta, the organization where Keisha was supposed to start working, to push for legislative reforms. The result was House Bill 247, known as Keisha's Law. The legislation, signed by the governor in March 2024, exactly 1 year after Keisha's death, made sweeping changes to how Georgia handles domestic violence cases. Abusers who violate protection orders are now required to wear GPS monitoring devices. Police officers responding to domestic violence calls must receive specialized training and are required to complete lethality assessments on every call. The law also established a victim advocate program, ensuring that every domestic violence survivor has someone to help them navigate the legal system. Funding was allocated for emergency shelters and counseling services. Most importantly, the law created a database that tracks domestic violence offenders across county lines, preventing them from simply moving to a new jurisdiction to escape consequences. Mama Ruby became the face of domestic violence advocacy in Georgia, speaking at conferences and rallies, meeting with legislators, sharing Keisha's story with anyone who would listen. "My granddaughter died for this," she would tell audiences. "The least I can do is make sure her death saves other women's lives." The Keisha Williams Foundation was established 6 months after her death, funded by donations from around the country. The foundation provides emergency assistance to domestic violence survivors, helps them find safe housing and legal representation, and runs educational programs in schools and communities about recognizing the warning signs of abuse. Every year on March 8th, the foundation awards the Keisha Williams Scholarship to a Spelman College student who plans to work in social services or victim advocacy. The scholarship covers full tuition and provides mentorship opportunities with professionals in the field. It's designed to help other young women achieve the dreams that Keisha never got to pursue. But perhaps the most powerful part of Keisha's legacy is the women who are alive today because of the changes her death inspired. Women like Maria Santos, who was able to get emergency housing through the foundation when her husband threatened to kill her. Women like Jennifer Thomas, whose abusive ex-boyfriend was arrested for violating his GPS monitoring device before he could hurt her again. The system didn't save Keisha Williams, but her death exposed the cracks in that system and gave her family the motivation to fix them. Her voice, silenced by violence, continues to speak through every law that's passed, every woman who's saved, every young person who learns to recognize the warning signs of abuse. Marcus Johnson may have taken Keisha's life, but he couldn't take her impact. He couldn't stop her from becoming exactly what she'd always wanted to be, someone who helped other people survive the worst moments of their lives. Today, Mama Ruby Williams sits in her kitchen, the same kitchen where Keisha used to do her homework, surrounded by photos of her granddaughter and letters from women whose lives have been saved by Keisha's law. At 74 years old, she's become one of the most recognized voices in the fight against domestic violence. But she'll tell you that's not how she wanted to spend her golden years. "My baby didn't die for nothing," Mama Ruby says, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years of grief and determination. "Every time I speak at one of those conferences, every time I see another woman get the help Keisha never got, I know she's still here with us. She's still fighting, just in a different way." The kitchen table where Keisha once spread out her homework is now covered with legislative proposals, victim advocacy materials, and thank you cards from survivors. Mama Ruby reads every letter that comes to the foundation, personally responds to emails from women asking for help, and keeps Keisha's photo on her desk as a reminder of why this work matters. But Keisha's story isn't unique, and that's perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this entire case. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 1 in 4 Black women will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Black women are murdered by intimate partners at rates nearly 3 times higher than white women. The reasons are complex, involving everything from systemic racism and law enforcement to economic disparities that make it harder for Black women to leave abusive relationships. In communities where calling the police might put your family at risk for different reasons, where resources are scarce and support systems are stretched thin, domestic violence often thrives in the shadows. Women like Keisha face additional barriers when seeking help, barriers that the foundation now works specifically to address. "We can't just treat this like it's an individual problem," Mama Ruby explains. "This is about communities, about systems, about the way our society treats Black women when they ask for help. Keisha had education. She had family support. She did everything right. And she still died. That tells you this is bigger than just one bad relationship." The foundation has partnered with Black churches, historically Black colleges and universities, and community organizations to reach women who might not otherwise know help is available. They've trained hairstylists, teachers, and community leaders to recognize signs of abuse and connect victims with resources. They've created a mobile app that looks like a normal weather app but actually connects users to emergency services and safety planning tools. These innovations have already saved lives. In 2024 alone, the foundation helped over 800 women escape abusive relationships. The GPS monitoring requirements of Keisha's law have led to 156 arrests of abusers who violated protection orders. The enhanced police training has resulted in more thorough investigations and higher conviction rates for domestic violence cases. But the work is far from over. For every woman the foundation helps, there are dozens more who are still trapped, still afraid, still believing that they have nowhere to turn. The statistics remain staggering. Every day in America, more than 3 women are murdered by their intimate partners. Every minute, nearly 20 people are physically abused by an intimate partner. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please know that help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and can be reached at 1-800-799-7233. For text support, you can text START to 88788. These services are free, confidential, and available in multiple languages. The Keisha Williams Foundation can be reached through their website, where you'll find resources specifically designed for Black women and communities of color. They provide emergency financial assistance, help with legal advocacy, and connections to culturally competent counseling services. If you want to help support this work, there are several ways to get involved. You can donate to domestic violence organizations in your community, volunteer at local shelters, or advocate for stronger laws protecting survivors. You can also help by learning to recognize the warning signs of abuse and speaking up when you see them. The warning signs include extreme jealousy, controlling behavior, isolation from friends and family, threats of violence, and escalating anger. If someone you know is showing these signs, don't wait for them to ask for help. Reach out, let them know you're concerned, and help them connect with professional resources. Keisha's vision board, the one that disappeared from her apartment wall during those dark months with Marcus, was eventually found among her belongings after her death. Mama Ruby has it hanging in the foundation's office now, a reminder of dreams that were cut short but not forgotten. The words Williams Events are still there in bold letters, surrounded by pictures of beautiful weddings and celebrations that Keisha hoped to plan. Next to those images, Mama Ruby has added new pictures, photos of the women the foundation has helped, the laws that have been passed, the scholarships that have been awarded. She's turned Keisha's vision board into something bigger than one woman's dreams. It's become a symbol of hope for every woman who needs to know that escape is possible, that help is available, that someone cares enough to fight for their safety. Keisha always wanted to plan events that brought people together, Mama Ruby says. In a way, that's exactly what she's doing. She's bringing together lawmakers and advocates, survivors and supporters, communities that are saying we won't accept this anymore. The last entry in Keisha's journal, found after her death, read, "I survived something that could have killed me, and now I want to help other women survive too." Those words have become the motto of the foundation, a reminder that survival is just the beginning of healing, and that healing can become a source of strength for others. Keisha Williams was 26 years old when she died. She never got to open her event planning business, never got to help the domestic violence survivors she'd planned to work with, never got to see the changes her death would inspire. But her voice continues to echo in every life that's saved, every law that's passed, every young woman who learns that love should never hurt. If Keisha's story moved you, if it opened your eyes to the reality of domestic violence, or if you believe her legacy deserves to be shared, please take a moment to like this video. Your engagement helps us reach more people with stories that matter. Subscribe to our channel if you want to stay updated on cases like this one, stories that honor victims while shedding light on the systems that need to change. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own experiences with domestic violence resources. Tell us about other cases you think we should cover, or simply let us know how Keisha's story affected you. And if you think this story could help someone else recognize warning signs or find the courage to seek help, please share this video. Check out our channel for more true crime stories that focus on justice, advocacy, and honoring victims' memories. You'll find cases that examine system failures, celebrate survivors, and highlight the ongoing fight for change. The end screen will show you some recommendations for similar stories that we think you'll find just as compelling. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for helping us make sure that stories like Keisha's are never forgotten.